person we get to introduce is Bill Tefft. Bill Tefft is our new Youth Mentor Program Coordinator. Many of you know Bill from his time volunteering at the Minnesota State Fair at the MOU booth. So here's a little bit about Bill before he shares his screen. Bill is a 45-year resident of Ely, Minnesota, who has spent all of that time exploring, observing, and learning about the activities of birds and their relationships with the northern forests and on the lakes. Bill has a wealth of experience. He's taught students at Vermilion Community College for 33 years. He's led friends and family on field trips throughout northeastern Minnesota and throughout all of the state of Minnesota. He's taught Elderhostels, Master Naturalists, Rhodes Scholars, continuing education classes, classes at Hawk Ridge, classes on the North Shore, and across the Arrowhead. Bill has written nature columns in local newspapers, conducted a weekly local radio program called Birding with Bill. He helped form the Ely Field Naturalists. He's conducted programs and activities for all ages and has provided interpretive programs for the Superior National Forest and the Minnesota State Parks. Bill's greatest interest is searching for relationships and digging deeper to find connections that support birds and other organisms living in our communities. Bill will be teaching us about Northwoods forest cavity makers and dwellers. And Bill, I know you were on the line before, so go ahead and share screen and we're ready to roll.
Let me see. Can you hear me?
Yes. We can, yep.
Okay, now I just have to share the screen. Welcome everybody to Ely, northeastern Minnesota, and I'm excited to be linked in with you wherever you are, and excited about sharing a little bit about this time of the year here and any questions that you have maybe about other times of the year also. Just to update you a little bit on what we're experiencing is, I think 12 degrees this morning, and the open water that has been coming and going on a few of our rivers are primarily exposing waterfowl to us, like the hooded merganser that I have a picture of sitting next to me here, but really we're most excited about trumpeter swans kind of positioning themselves in pairs and more along the rivers, waiting for open water areas for them to move into as the season progresses. But it'll be a while before we have open water, shallow water lakes and things. We also have golden eyes paired up and more of them competing for pairing. And we have hooded mergansers showing up, kind of the first of some males. So those all those water things fit into our water and forest world up here. Water in the form of snow right now. But this picture is one that I just took a couple of days ago, and it's one of the things that I'm very excited about because everything relates up here to each other pretty much. And so the forest relates to the waters and the lakes and various other kinds of species. And the one of the things that I look for throughout the year, but also at this time of the year, is freshly created cavities in trees, like in this quaking aspen tree. And this kind of a cavity can only be made by one thing, and it's different from this kind of a cavity, which is at the base of a tree. That's not really a cavity, but it's an opening that was created from a bird that was trying to feed on what it could find there at the base of the tree. And so that bird could be making cavities up here higher in the trees to nest in or roost in throughout the year, and nesting coming up, or they could be down in the base of the tree, excavating the tree like this. And so it's often very confusing to people up here to determine what really is a nest cavity or a roosting cavity and what is a feeding area. But you can clearly see if you come and wander around in our forests that if you look inside of this kind of cavity with the big rectangular openings and things in that tree, that this bird was really excavating the tree to get at what was living in there, and that was predominantly carpenter ants. And you have, it's not like this is unusual to northeastern Minnesota. You have the same thing where you live, and we have actually the same thing throughout the whole eastern United States. It just means that up here, sometimes this tree species or the trees that are suitable for this maybe are more specific to our region. And they can be aspen trees, it can be quaking aspen, they can be big tooth aspen, they can be red pine, they can be white pine, red pine more commonly, but they need to be trees that are somewhere, generally, if it's going to be a nest cavity, as opposed to a feeding cavity like these, or like this, where it's a birch tree and they're taking off the bark to again get at the ant galleries inside. It's the work of pileated woodpeckers, and as I'm sure most all of you know, I may have pronounced it either correctly or wrongly, depending on your point of view, whether you say pileated or pileated. It seems to be either seems to be acceptable and interchangeable, even though I believe the correct pronunciation of what it's named for is that crest on top of its head, which I believe is properly pronounced the pileus. So I tend to go towards pileated, but this is a feeding area. This is one at the base of a tree, immersed in excavating to get ants. And this is what we see these like in the wintertime, when they're not ready to nest yet, but they're coming to sometimes our suet feeders, but also still feeding on the base of trees in many areas, and often so busy at it that you can walk right up to them. But this is the end product that they're working towards, is to, at this time of year, we're just beginning to start to see them excavate nesting cavities, and they'll create a large opening in one of those larger trees or a power pole, and lay their eggs in there. And in the beginning, they can work on hatching those eggs, but then they may or may not roost in there during the evening hours, but they'll come and go and feed the young birds that are there. And so we had a brochure that this picture was placed on, that we called Tefft's 10. One of the Master Naturalist students created it of 10 different birding areas in our area. And we have many birds that people consider are birds that are of greatest interest or significance up here. It might be pileated woodpeckers, it could be loons, it's could be great gray owls, it could be great Canada jays, it could be many things, it could be many warblers. So the choices are kind of endless, but every species has a story. And I particularly like to see how the species stories end up associating them, like we've already talked about with this woodpecker, in terms of its association with certain types of trees. And looking into the trees, oftentimes you'll find, if it's an aspen tree, that tree has various kinds of fungi that are growing, mycelia in the dead wood, and you can see the fruiting bodies on the outside. And so for a woodpecker like this, on aspen trees and on other trees too, if they can push through the living tissue, the outer layer of the tree, they can get to the dead wood inside. And if it's a little bit punky, it just makes it easier to excavate and create the size of cavity that they're going to need to have. As you can see, several young that are going to grow up to almost the adult size before they leave this cavity. There's going to be no room for this adult once they've got birds inside that are this size. And both males and females will continue to feed those birds, and they'll come and go to feed them, but roost elsewhere in the off hours. And so that's kind of what we're looking for. But sometimes when we notice these cavities and we go up, and I don't know if anybody else has experienced this. I came across it, not this particular bird, but I came across a white pine stand, a wayside rest that had a cavity in a tree right above me as I pulled in, and I saw a flicker fly into it. And so this cavity was already in use. It wasn't being created by the flicker. Could well have been created by a pileated woodpecker previous to that. And so I went over and I just took a stick and scraped the bark, and the flicker stuck his head out and looked at me, what kind of like this bird is here. And then I thought, well, that's interesting, in the sense there were many of these large trees around. I walked the kind of a circle around on the driveways, and every time I found a cavity like that, I scratched on it, and out of 7 cavities, 4 different birds poked their head out and looked down at me. And one was a pileated woodpecker, and one was a wood duck, which we don't see all that much up here. And one was a saw-whet owl. And so the idea that during late May, which is not that far off, and going into June, when, as we know, almost all of our migratory birds are back, and our resident birds are also in the process, like the migratory birds are, of beginning to nest, that these cavities are prime housing units for whatever may need them. And so ever since that time, I've considered pileated woodpeckers to be very special, in my opinion, because I look at them like a keystone species, like beavers are in terms of creating wetland areas, ponds, beaver ponds, for many things to live in and nest in and feed in and those sorts of things. This bird that you're looking at can't make a cavity like that. It needs a cavity like that. It's kind of like the wood duck boxes that you put up in maybe in your area, or we put up here some, but our area is not really an area that's abundant in wood ducks. Wood ducks may be on some beaver ponds. That may be what's serving them better because of the shallow water and the habitat areas. And so the wood duck boxes would be most productive there. But for our lakes and our rivers to some extent, we're really, northeastern Minnesota is a land of diving ducks. And so whether it's hooded mergansers like this bird, female hooded mergansers, or golden eyes, or many other types of birds, they all are species that need a cavity, and that's not even all of them. We could also include owls, smaller species of owls that need cavities, and we'll talk more as we go along. But again, this is another aspen tree. There's an area that I kind of keep track of areas, because you'll end up sometimes finding a number of trees because of pileated woodpeckers living in that area. And whether we know it entirely for certain or not, it seems like most of the time pileated woodpeckers don't reuse the same cavities. So part of their instigation or beginning of nesting and courting, even though they maintain the pairs oftentimes throughout the year, is to build a new cavity. And so that means there's old cavities, there's multiple cavities, because like we said earlier, they not only lay their eggs and have their young, brood their young in a cavity each year, they also each need a place to roost during that time that the young are developing. So an area may have several cavities, even multiple cavities in the same tree. And so as a result, whoever gets there first, in some cases can be the species that ends up in a nest. And so some of you may have seen this very same thing as you're looking at here, or here at a wood duck box. And so you can just transfer your experience that you've had with wood ducks, needing a tree cavity or a box, and the young developing there, and then once they're larger, jumping out. I would like to say, and I hope that we have some discussion as we go along here in a bit, but I would like to say that every time you learn something, you realize that there's a lot that you don't know. And just the experience of scraping a tree and having a bird do what this bird is doing, essentially fill the opening, makes me ask a lot of questions, and I don't necessarily know the answers to them. Since it's such a common behavior, I kind of wonder if it's not a response that might be a response that they would make to a predator. So suppose your tree has a pine marten climbing it, which could fit in this cavity, could have its own young in a cavity like this, might be coming to raid your nest. And so is this a deterrent to a predator, being faced by a pileated woodpecker or a hooded merganser, like in this case, or some other species looking down at you? And so is that the bird's just reaction to what sounds like the scratching scratching noise that a predator would make as it climbed the tree, of whatever type of predator it might be? And so with that, I'm not an advocate for harassing birds. It's more of just a reporting and data collection study, really. And so you don't need to do it often. You don't need to take your friends all to see this happen. You can take your friends maybe on your initial investigation, but the message is really don't keep going back and doing this over and over again to a species, but and don't beat on the tree. I guess whether this works anywhere else in the country, I don't know, but it is a way up here to investigate and see what use is being made of tree cavities. And so this hooded merganser is in a tree. This pileated woodpecker is in a power pole. And certainly if you're up in our country, maybe in your country too, if you drive any of the back roads or even some of the main roads, you'll see many, almost all power poles have some kind of protection to prevent pileated woodpeckers from making these cavities, even though they often do, and they're pretty persistent about going through things if the size of the container is potentially big enough. So this is one in a power pole.
Hey, Bill, I don't mean to be rude and jump in, but we're coming close to being over time. So we want to let you have a minute or two to wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll just zip through a number of images here, but this is a common goldeneye. Again, cavity nester and a power pole that has been screened to prevent pileated woodpeckers, but you can see it didn't work.
That was awesome.
Tree with a number of holes, some of which may have been test holes. And so it's maybe not every tree even works. More wood ducks, more woodpeckers. And you'll see there's both males and females at times sticking their heads out since they both feed their young. Many illustrations of woodpeckers that you'll find in books that show them at their cavities. So they're known for that kind of arrangement. And in some cases, occupant isn't a duck or a woodpecker, it's a saw-whet owl. Or in one case, in the wintertime, I scratched on a tree that had cavities in, and about 5 flying squirrels came shooting out and looking down at me. So the number of species, and I already mentioned pine martens and fishers having families in these trees, are all exciting adventure things. And so in the world of northeastern Minnesota, we could talk about any number of species. I just use this as an example, and each one has a story. And I would encourage you, wherever you are, to look farther than just identifying a bird or a species, but look at how they relate to everything else around them. And if anybody wants to explore any of these things more, you can text me or call me or email me.